You may have spent years giving everything you had to someone who always seemed to need more: your attention, your energy, your reassurance, your emotional reactions, while receiving little genuine appreciation in return. But eventually, something changes. You stop explaining, you stop chasing, you become quiet, pull your energy back, and refuse to keep participating in the same cycle. That is often when the narcissistic dynamic begins to destabilize. It is not simply that they become irritated because you are no longer responding. Your withdrawal removes something they may have depended on to maintain their sense of importance and control. Attention, admiration, reassurance, conflict, and even your anger can all become forms of emotional fuel. When that fuel suddenly disappears, the person who depended on it may experience intense confusion and distress. A narcissistic personality structure can involve a fragile sense of self that depends heavily on outside validation. Instead of having a stable inner belief in their own worth, they may constantly look toward other people to reinforce the identity they want to maintain. That is why your attention can become so important to them. You were not simply someone in their life. You may have become part of the system they used to regulate how they felt about themselves. So when you begin practicing no contact, stop reacting to provocations, or simply establish firm boundaries, your independence can feel threatening to that system. Your boundary is not necessarily interpreted as a reasonable decision. It may be experienced as rejection, disrespect, or even betrayal. And this is where the panic can begin. Without the familiar source of attention, they are suddenly confronted with feelings they have spent enormous energy avoiding. Instead of quietly examining their behavior, they may become desperate to restore the old dynamic. They may reach out, provoke you, create unnecessary conflict, or search for another source of attention. The goal is often less about understanding what went wrong and more about restoring the emotional arrangement that previously made them feel secure. There is another piece of this dynamic that is difficult to understand from the outside. Some narcissistic relationships function as though the other person has been assigned a role. You may have been expected to listen, forgive, reassure, admire, rescue, absorb blame, or constantly prove your loyalty. Over time, the individual can begin treating your role as though it is permanent. Then you change. You stop playing the part. Suddenly, the person who always answered does not answer. The person who used to defend them no longer explains. The person who once tolerated the emotional chaos begins protecting their peace. To a healthy person, this can look like someone finally making an independent decision. But within a controlling narcissistic dynamic, that independence can create enormous confusion. It is almost as though the rules of the relationship have suddenly stopped working. They may struggle to understand why you no longer respond the way you once did. Instead of accepting that you have reached your limit, they may search for another explanation. Perhaps you met someone else. Perhaps you are trying to punish them. Perhaps you are hiding something. Perhaps someone has influenced you. The possibility that you simply recognized your own value can be the hardest explanation for them to accept. Because if you can leave without their permission, then they are forced to confront a reality they did not expect. You were never actually an extension of them. You were a separate person with your own mind, boundaries, choices, and future. That realization is at the heart of the shock. Your silence is not necessarily revenge. Your distance is not necessarily a manipulation. Sometimes it is simply what happens when a person finally understands that continuing the relationship is costing them too much. And once you stop supplying the old reactions, the entire pattern can begin to change. The most powerful thing you can do is not to destroy them, punish them, or make them panic. It is to stop abandoning yourself just to keep someone else emotionally comfortable. That is where narcissist recovery truly begins. When someone has spent a long time conditioning you to respond to their moods, demands, and emotional pressure, they can become deeply accustomed to having influence over your reactions. Your boundaries may have been challenged so many times that they began assuming you would eventually give in. So when you suddenly become silent and stop participating, they may struggle to imagine that this time you actually mean it. At first, the silence may not frighten them at all. Instead, they may convince themselves that this is temporary. In their mind, you are probably upset, trying to make a point, or attempting to get a reaction from them. They expect you to eventually become uncomfortable with the distance and reach out first. This creates a strange waiting period. They may sit back with a sense of confidence, assuming you will eventually return to the familiar pattern. They believe they can simply wait longer than you can. Because they became accustomed to your availability, they may assume your attachment to them is just as strong as their dependence on your attention. So rather than seeing your silence as a genuine decision to leave, they may interpret it as another move within the same emotional game. From the outside, they might even appear completely unaffected. They may act casual. They may post as though everything is normal. They may behave around other people as if your absence means absolutely nothing. Sometimes this performance is designed to make you question yourself. If they look perfectly fine without you, you may start wondering whether you mattered at all. But appearances do not necessarily reveal what is happening internally. At this stage, they can still be holding on to the belief that you will eventually return. They are waiting for the familiar pattern to restart. They expect the person who always explained, forgave, responded, or came back to eventually step through that door again. The longer you remain consistent, however, the harder that belief becomes to maintain. Eventually, the waiting can turn into testing. Once they realize your silence is not simply an emotional reaction that will disappear, they may begin looking for ways to discover whether they can still get a response from you. The goal is not necessarily genuine reconciliation. They want information. Are you still reachable? Do you still care? Can they still make you angry? Will you still rush to help them? Can they still influence your emotions? This is where small, seemingly harmless messages may appear. A casual, "How have you been?" A random meme, a question about something insignificant, a message pretending to need information about an old possession. Anything can become an excuse to reopen communication. The important part is not always the message itself, it is what your response tells them. If you become angry, they learn that they can still activate you. If you immediately become compassionate and start explaining yourself, they discover that the emotional connection is still available. Even a long defensive response can provide evidence that they still have access to your attention. To someone attempting to break an unhealthy cycle, this distinction is extremely important. Not every attempt to contact you represents genuine change. Sometimes it is simply a test of whether the old dynamic can still be restarted. And if the softer approach fails, the tactics may become more intense. They might suddenly present themselves as being in trouble. They may create an urgent situation that supposedly requires your involvement. They could use mutual friends or acquaintances to gather information about you, casually asking how you are doing or whether you have moved on. Even when they are not speaking to you directly, having their name carried back to you can keep them psychologically present. That is why detachment is more than simply refusing to answer a message. It is about refusing to let every indirect signal pull you back into the emotional world you worked so hard to leave. They may keep checking the connection, searching for any sign that you are still emotionally available. Your consistency is what changes the pattern. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, and stop allowing every new attempt to become an invitation back into the cycle, the old system loses its ability to function. And that is when your silence stops being a temporary absence and becomes a boundary they can no longer easily ignore. This is not about making someone suffer. It is about no longer sacrificing your peace simply to prove that you care. When they begin to realize that you may actually be gone, their behavior can become increasingly desperate. The real question for them is whether they still occupy a place in your thoughts. They need some kind of evidence that the connection has not truly ended, that you are simply taking a temporary step back and will eventually return to the role they became accustomed to. But when your distance continues and it becomes clear that you are not coming back, another shift can occur. They may begin rewriting the story. This is where strategic victimhood enters the picture. Accepting that you walked away because the relationship was unhealthy can be deeply threatening to someone whose identity depends on appearing blameless or superior. So instead of facing that reality, they may construct an entirely different explanation. Suddenly, they are the one who was mistreated. You become the unreasonable, cruel, unstable, or heartless person who supposedly abandoned them without justification. This protects their image. They may begin telling friends, relatives, coworkers, or mutual acquaintances a carefully edited version of what happened. They might describe themselves as the patient one who tried everything, while portraying you as the person who suddenly changed and turned against them. This can serve another purpose as well. If you eventually decide to tell your side of the story, they want everyone to already have doubts about you. By speaking first, they can plant their version of events in other people's minds before you have an opportunity to explain what really happened. In other words, they may try to control the story before the truth has a chance to catch up. The important thing to recognize is that this behavior is usually less about understanding you and more about protecting the identity they want other people to believe. If they admit that someone left because their behavior became harmful, they have to confront an uncomfortable question about themselves. So instead, you become the villain. They may emphasize how hurt they are, cry in front of others, express confusion about why you suddenly became cold, or repeatedly talk about how badly you supposedly treated them. Their vulnerability may appear convincing because it is built around a real emotion. They may genuinely feel distressed, but distress does not automatically mean accountability. Then comes one of the most recognizable attempts to restore the old connection, the Hoover. Once waiting, indirect testing, and victim narratives fail to bring you back, they may change strategy completely. Suddenly, the person who seemed indifferent can become incredibly affectionate. They may apologize, promise to change, talk about the future, or remind you of the beautiful moments you shared. Sometimes the approach is subtle, other times it can be dramatic. They might suddenly claim to understand everything. They may say they have finally realized what they did wrong. They could promise that this time will be different or insist that they cannot imagine life without you. Gifts may appear, emotional messages may arrive, old memories may be brought back to life. Even emergencies or personal crises can become reasons to pull you back into contact. What makes this confusing is that some of these words may sound exactly like what you once wanted to hear. But words alone are not evidence of transformation. Real change requires consistent behavior, accountability, respect for boundaries, and a willingness to accept the consequences of past actions. A sudden flood of promises after losing access to you does not automatically prove that genuine growth has occurred. This is why narcissist recovery requires you to look beyond the emotional intensity of the moment. The question is not, do they sound sorry? The better question is, has their behavior consistently changed? A person can say everything you have dreamed of hearing and still return to the same destructive patterns once they feel secure again. The Hoover often works because it activates your empathy. You remember the good moments. You remember who they were at the beginning. You begin wondering whether this time could finally be different. That emotional conflict is exactly what makes this stage so powerful. But if the attempts to pull you back continue failing, another reaction may emerge. The warmth disappears, the sympathy disappears, the carefully controlled image begins to crack. What follows can be anger. The same person who was recently apologizing may suddenly become hostile when they realize their emotional pressure is no longer producing the response they expected. The charm can give way to resentment. The victim story can become accusations. The affectionate messages can become insults, threats, blame, or attempts to provoke you. This is often where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. They wanted access to you. They tried waiting. They tested your boundaries. They changed the story. They attempted to pull you back with promises and emotional pressure. And when none of those methods work, frustration can become rage. That shift is important because it reveals why maintaining your boundaries matters. Your goal is not to trigger their panic or punish them for what they did. Your goal is to stop allowing another person's emotional reactions to determine what you do with your life. You do not have to keep proving your worth by staying available. You do not have to return simply because someone suddenly promises to become the person you needed all along. Sometimes the strongest response is simply recognizing the pattern, protecting your peace, and refusing to step back into a role you have finally outgrown. When their attempts to regain access to you fail, anger can become the next strategy. At that point, the goal is no longer connection, it is reaction. They may want to prove that they can still frighten you, upset you, or pull you into defending yourself. This kind of anger can become especially destructive when they feel their influence slipping away. They may use things they learned about your fears, insecurities, or vulnerabilities to deliberately hurt you. In some situations, this can involve insults, smear campaigns, threats, exposing private information, or attempts to damage your relationships, reputation, or work. The objective is control. If they can make you cry, argue, panic, or desperately explain yourself, they have evidence that they can still affect you. Even negative attention can become proof that they still occupy emotional space in your life. That is why this stage can feel so confusing. You may wonder why someone who supposedly wanted you back would suddenly try to hurt you. Because the goal was never necessarily resolution, the goal was to regain power. When someone has become accustomed to controlling the emotional atmosphere, your independence can feel like a direct challenge to that control. Your refusal to participate in the conflict removes the reaction they were hoping to create. And when the reaction does not come, their attempts may become more intense. For your own safety and well being, this is the point where boundaries matter most. You do not need to win an argument, prove your innocence, or convince them to understand your perspective. If there are threats, harassment, stalking, or attempts to interfere with your work or relationships, prioritize your safety, document what happens, and seek appropriate support. Eventually, if every attempt to restore the old dynamic fails, another strategy may appear, the final discard. This can happen when they realize that waiting, testing, manipulation, reconciliation attempts, and anger have not brought you back. The reality of your separation becomes too obvious to ignore. Rather than sitting with the pain of being rejected, they may try to rewrite the ending so that it appears they were the one who chose to leave. Suddenly, you are the person they supposedly never needed. The relationship may be dismissed, your importance may be minimized, they may become extremely cold or disappear without explanation. Sometimes they move toward another relationship surprisingly quickly, which can leave you questioning whether the entire connection ever meant anything. But someone replacing you quickly does not determine your value. People cope with loss in very different ways, and moving quickly into another relationship does not automatically reveal what they feel internally. In unhealthy narcissistic dynamics, however, a new relationship can sometimes function as a way to restore attention, validation, or a sense of importance. For the person left behind, this can feel devastating. You may ask yourself, how could they move on so easily? You may wonder why they are telling other people that you were the problem. You may question whether any of the good moments were real. Those questions are understandable, but their behavior does not define the meaning of your experience. Sometimes the final attempt at control is simply changing the story so they do not have to face the reality that you chose to leave. If they can convince themselves that they rejected you first, they can avoid confronting the deeper wound of being rejected themselves. But you do not need to participate in that rewritten version of events. Walking away from a narcissistic relationship is not always a simple decision followed by instant peace. You are not merely separating from a person. You may also be breaking habits, expectations, emotional conditioning, and patterns that developed over a long period of time. That is why healing can take time. You may experience relief one day and doubt the next. You may feel strong in the morning and miss the relationship at night. None of that means you made the wrong decision. It means you are processing something that affected you deeply. The important thing is to keep returning to reality rather than being pulled back by temporary emotions. Look at the pattern. Look at how you were treated. Look at what happened when you established boundaries. Look at whether their actions consistently matched their promises. Your freedom does not depend on whether they understand why you left. You do not need their apology to validate your experience. You do not need their agreement to make your boundary legitimate. And you certainly do not need their reaction to prove that you were valuable. Your life begins to change when their behavior stops determining your choices. So if they become angry, remember that you do not have to enter the fight. If they suddenly become affectionate, remember that words are not the same as lasting change. If they replace you quickly, remember that someone else's behavior is not a measurement of your worth. The goal of narcissist recovery is not to make them panic. It is to stop organizing your life around their emotions. You are allowed to choose peace without explaining it endlessly. You are allowed to close a door that repeatedly harmed you. You are allowed to reclaim your time, your attention, your confidence, and your future. What you lost was not your value. What you are recovering is your freedom. And sometimes the most powerful ending is not watching them fall apart. It is realizing that their chaos no longer has the authority to determine who you become.